April 16, 1945. Dawn broke over radar Picket Station number 1, 50 miles north of Okinawa, and the sea lay flat as hammered steel under a colorless sky. Lieutenant Frank Manson stood on the bridge wing of USS Laffey, watching the horizon through salt-crusted binoculars, and tasted copper in his mouth, the metallic tang of fear mixed with exhaust fumes from the ship's stacks. Below him, 336 men went about their morning routines, checking guns, swabbing decks, writing letters they hoped would reach home. None of them knew that in 90 minutes they would face what Japanese commanders had designed as certain death, and that their survival would shake the confidence of an empire, willing to sacrifice its own sons as guided missiles. The destroyer had been on station for 3 days, a lonely sentinel in enemy waters. Her mission was brutally simple: detect incoming aircraft before they could reach the invasion fleet and stop them. She was bait, deliberately exposed, equipped with the most advanced radar systems the United States Navy could provide. But radar could not stop a pilot who had already accepted death, who had said goodbye to his mother, who carried only enough fuel for a one-way journey. The Kamikaze, Divine Wind, represented Japan's final desperate gamble, a tactical innovation born from industrial weakness, transformed into spiritual strength. Or so the theory went. What the Japanese strategists had not calculated, could not have imagined from their besieged islands where steel had become precious as gold and oil a distant memory, was the sheer industrial might their enemy could bring to bear on a single ship. They knew the Americans had resources, yes, but numbers on paper could not capture the reality. The volume of ammunition, the redundancy of systems, the training that made every sailor a damage control expert, the radios that linked every gun position into a single organism of destruction. The kamikaze tactic was designed to exploit American fear of death, the assumption that men who loved life would break when confronted with men who embraced death. But fear is complex, and courage is not the absence of fear but the discipline to act despite it. At 07:47 hours, the radar operator's voice cracked across the intercom. Bogies inbound, bearing 340, range 30 miles. Many, many bogies. Commander Frederick Julian Becton, 44 years old, veteran of the Atlantic and Mediterranean campaigns, felt his stomach tighten. He had been expecting this. Every ship on picket duty had been hit. USS Bush and Colquhoun had gone down just 6 days earlier, overwhelmed by swarms of suicide planes. But expecting death and experiencing it are different things entirely. He lifted the microphone with a hand that showed only the slightest tremor, not fear but the body's honest preparation for combat, and his voice came out steady, almost conversational. All hands to battle stations, air action starboard. This is not a drill. 336 men moved with practiced efficiency to positions they had rehearsed until movement became muscle memory. Gunners stripped the covers from anti-aircraft weapons. Damage control teams staged hoses and pumps. Pharmacists' mates laid out surgical instruments in the wardroom turned operating theater. Engine room crews checked steam pressure, knowing that mobility meant survival. And in the radio room, operators began transmitting warnings to the fleet. The divine wind was coming, and it was hungry. The Japanese formation appeared as a dark smudge against the northern sky, then resolved into individual aircraft. Not the sleek fighters of propaganda, but a desperate hodgepodge of whatever could still fly. There were Aichi D-3A Valdive bombers, already obsolete when the war began. There were Yokosuka D-4Y Judy bombers, fast but fragile. There were even Mitsubishi A-6M Zeros, once the terror of the Pacific, now relegated to suicide missions because trained pilots who could use their maneuverability were long dead. 22 aircraft in total, each carrying a bomb, and a man who had written his farewell poem tied on his hachimaki headband, and accepted that his body would become a weapon. In the lead plane, Lieutenant Takeshi Kunitake, 23 years old, son of a rice farmer from Kumamoto Prefecture, checked his instruments with hands that no longer shook. 3 months of special training at Kanoya Air Base had taught him the technical skills: how to dive at the optimal angle, how to aim for the waterline where a hit would be fatal, how to ignore the anti-aircraft fire that would surround him like a steel storm. But the training had not prepared him for the emotional reality of this moment, the way his body wanted to live even as his mind had accepted death. He thought of his mother, as all the pilots did, and then forced the thought away. Sentiment was a weakness now. He was no longer Takeshi, individual human with dreams and fears. He was a weapon, a tool of the Emperor's will, a divine wind. The first contact came at 0802, range 8 miles. Laffey's 5-inch guns opened fire, and the morning shattered. Each gun could fire 15 rounds per minute, and the ship had 6 of them, 3 forward and 3 aft. That meant 90 shells per minute, arcing into the sky, each one a precisely calculated intersection of ballistics and electronics. The Mark 37 Fire Control Director, a mechanical computer of gears and motors sitting atop the bridge, tracked targets with radar and calculated firing solutions faster than any human gunner could manage. The Japanese had nothing equivalent. Their aircraft flew manually, their pilots relied on intuition and courage could not dodge mathematics. The first zero exploded at 6 miles out, a sudden orange flower against the blue. The pilot, his name is lost to history, did not have time to register his death. The proximity-fused shell detonated 30 feet from his aircraft, and shrapnel shredded aluminum skin, fuel tanks, and human flesh without discrimination. The plane tumbled from the sky, trailing black smoke, and on Laffey's deck, the gun crew allowed themselves a brief cheer before training their weapon on the next target. But 21 aircraft remained, and they were splitting up now, diving from different angles, using the sun, trying to overwhelm the ship's ability to track multiple threats. This was the moment the Japanese plan should have worked. No ship, however well armed, could defend against simultaneous attacks from multiple vectors. Gunners would have to choose which threats to engage, leaving others free to strike home. The mathematics of attrition favored the attackers, except that Laffey had 40mm Bofors guns, twin and quad mounts, scattered across her deck like steel mushrooms. These were not precision weapons, but volume of fire weapons, pumping out 120 rounds per minute per barrel, and she had 20mm Oerlikon cannons, single-mount weapons that a single sailor could aim and fire, 600 rounds per minute, of pure defensive fury. Every gun position had a radio link to the fire control director, which called out targets and priorities. Judy diving starboard bow, Val approaching port quarter. The calls came faster than breathing, and the gunners responded, swiveling their weapons, the training taking over, fear transformed into action. Lieutenant Kunitake pushed his stick forward and felt the acceleration press him back into his seat. The final dive, the moment of truth. He could see the American destroyer below him now, could see the white wakes from her screws as she maneuvered, could see the tracers reaching up toward him like deadly fireflies. The distance closed with terrifying speed, 3,000 feet, 2,000, 1,000. He aimed for the bridge, the nerve center, and in the last seconds before impact, he felt a strange peace. The acceptance that comes when all choices have been made, and only action remains. The Oerlikon gunner, Seaman Second Class Robert Johnson, 19 years old from Mobile, Alabama, saw the zero coming and did not think at all, just pointed his weapon and squeezed the trigger, feeling the gun buck against his shoulder, watching his tracers walk up toward the diving plane. The shells, each one the diameter of a man's thumb, punched through the Zero's cowling, through the engine block, through the pilot's chest and out through the seat behind him. The plane's trajectory barely changed, but Lieutenant Kunitake was dead before he could release his bomb, and the Zero slammed into Laffey's deck just aft of the bridge with a sound like the world ending. The explosion ripped through the deck, destroying the ship's galley, killing 3 sailors instantly, setting fire to everything within 30 feet. But the bomb had not detonated. Either it was a dud, Japanese quality control had suffered as the war dragged on, or the impact had damaged the fusing mechanism. It lay there, a quarter-ton of high explosive in the midst of the flames, and Seaman Johnson, unhurt but deafened by the blast, dropped his gun and ran toward the fire with an extinguisher, because that was what training demanded, even though every nerve in his body screamed to run the other way. The attack had lasted 60 seconds. 20 aircraft remained. Commander Becton watched from the bridge as a second Kamikaze dove from the port side, this one a Valdive bomber, older and slower but still deadly. The 5-inch guns could not depress low enough to hit it. The plane was too close inside the minimum range. But the 40mm Bofors crews tracked it with professional calm, their weapons hammering and the Val disintegrated 300 yards out, pieces of wing and fuselage spinning across the water, the bomb exploding harmlessly in the ocean, throwing up a geyser of white water that drenched the deck. "Good shooting," Becton said into the microphone, keeping his voice level. And then, the third Kamikaze hit. This one came in low, hugging the water to avoid radar, and pulled up only at the last moment. A textbook approach that would have made his instructors proud if they had lived long enough to see it. The Judy bomber struck Laffey's stern, punching through the thin plating near the fantail, and its bomb exploded inside the ship's aft compartments. The blast destroyed the steering mechanism, jammed the rudder hard over to the right, and killed 4 men in the steering room, who had no warning, no chance, who simply ceased to exist in the microsecond between explosion and awareness. Laffey began to circle to starboard, out of control, and this should have been the end. A ship that cannot steer, cannot maneuver, cannot present its weapons to incoming threats, becomes a stationary target for the remaining attackers. The Japanese pilots saw the destroyer's predicament and pressed their attacks with renewed ferocity, sensing victory. Each man eager to be the one who delivered the killing blow, who earned the honor of being named in the Emperor's daily war bulletin. But the Americans did not behave like men who understood they were beaten. In the engine room, Lieutenant Commander William Mackey, 31 years old, MIT engineering graduate, did not wait for orders. He had trained his crew for exactly this contingency. Using variations in engine speed between the port and starboard propellers, he could create asymmetric thrust, effectively steering the ship without a rudder. It was crude, imprecise, but it kept Laffey moving, kept her guns bearing on targets, bought seconds that translated into survival. On deck, the damage control parties worked with a desperation that transcended courage into something primal, the human animal's refusal to accept death. Fire threatened to reach the forward ammunition magazine, which contained 50 tons of high-explosive shells, enough to vaporize the entire forward half of the ship. Ensign James Youngman, 22 years old, led a team into the smoke and heat, dragging hoses, and when the hoses proved insufficient, they formed a bucket brigade, passing helmets full of seawater hand to hand, throwing the water onto flames so hot that it evaporated before it hit metal. Youngman's hands blistered, then bled, the skin simply cooking off. But he did not stop because stopping meant dying, and some part of his brain had decided that he would not give the Japanese the satisfaction. The fourth Kamikaze, a Zero, piloted by a man whose name we know only from the cherry blossom insignia on his tail, struck the ship's midsection, destroying the number 3 5-inch gun mount and killing 6 of the 7-man crew. The survivor, gunner's mate, third-class Lawrence Delowski, was blown clear by the explosion, landed in a heap of torn metal, and found himself covered in parts of his friends. He vomited, then dragged himself to the nearest Oerlikon cannon, its operator dead at the weapon, and began firing at the next incoming plane, because there was nothing else to do, nowhere else to be. And the alternative was to sit in the wreckage and wait for death, watching from 10,000 feet above, in a circling Ki-46 reconnaissance plane. Commander Takeo Shibata of the Imperial Japanese Navy felt something he had not expected: doubt. The radio reports had been clear: multiple hits on the American destroyer, fires visible across her deck, steering disabled. By all tactical doctrine, the ship should be sinking or at least dead in the water. Instead, she continued moving, her guns still firing, and plane after plane fell from the sky before reaching her. How was this possible? The Americans were not supposed to be this resilient, this stubborn, this technically proficient. The kamikaze tactic worked through overwhelming the enemy's will to fight, breaking their psychological resistance through the horror of facing men who welcomed death. But these Americans seemed not to care about the horror. They simply kept fighting with a mechanical efficiency that Shibata found more frightening than any display of rage or courage. He keyed his radio and transmitted to the remaining pilots: "Concentrate all attacks on the bridge, command and control, kill the head and the body dies." It was sound tactical thinking, but it was also an admission that the body, the ship, the crew, the weapons, had proven far harder to kill than anticipated. The fifth kamikaze followed these orders exactly. The pilot, flying a Judy bomber, dove straight for the bridge where Commander Becton stood. Every gun that could bear opened fire. The tracers converged on the diving plane like streams of light, and the Judy staggered in midair as shells tore through it. But momentum carried it forward, and it hit the base of the bridge at 300 miles per hour. The explosion threw Becton across the small space, slamming him into the chart table. He felt ribs crack, tasted blood, and for a moment, the world went gray at the edges. When his vision cleared, he saw that the forward bulkhead of the bridge was gone, simply erased, and fire was spreading from the radar compartment below. The ship's executive officer, Lieutenant Commander Manley Carpenter, lay in a spreading pool of blood, a piece of shrapnel embedded in his thigh. The helmsman was dead, sprawled across the wheel. "Casualty report," Becton croaked, and his voice sounded distant to his own ears, the ringing from the explosion drowning out everything else. A radio man. Becton could not remember his name, could barely remember his own name, appeared with a headset. "Forward engine room reports flooding. After steering destroyed. Fire in the galley and crew berthing. 30% casualties estimated. 30%. More than 100 men, dead or wounded. And the attack was not over." Through the gaping hole where the bridge forward window had been, Becton could see 3 more aircraft circling, preparing their dives. He pulled himself upright, feeling something grind in his chest, and reached for the microphone. His hand shook now, no longer the slight tremor of preparation, but the uncontrollable shaking of shock and blood loss. It did not matter. The crew needed to hear his voice. "All stations, this is the captain. We are still fighting. We will continue fighting. If we go down with our guns firing. Acknowledge." The responses came back one by one, from gun positions and damage control stations, and the engine rooms deep in the ship's belly. Aye, sir." Acknowledged. "Ready to fight, Captain." Some of the voices were steady, some broken by pain or fear, but they all answered because that was what the Navy had trained them to do, and in this moment training was all that kept chaos at bay. The 6th kamikaze came in from astern, skimming so low that its propeller churned the water, rising only at the last second. The aft 40mm gun mount tracked it perfectly. The gunner had been an arcade shooting gallery operator before the war, and his eye-hand coordination was preternatural. But the weapon jammed after 12 rounds. a spent shell casing caught in the ejector. The gunner, aviation machinist's mate, Manuel Gonzalez, did not hesitate. He grabbed the casing with his bare hand, burning his palm, jerked it free, and resumed firing in time to put 6 more shells into the Kamikaze's engine. The plane lost power, dropped, and hit the water 30 feet from the ship's stern, so close that the explosion threw spray across the fantail, but it missed. It missed by 30 feet, which was the difference between survival and death, which was the payoff for Gonzalez's burned hand and the microseconds he had saved by not stopping to think about the pain. The clock on the bridge bulkhead, its glass face cracked but still functioning, showed 08:33. The attack had been ongoing for 31 minutes, which felt like hours, which felt like forever. Becton counted the aircraft remaining in the sky. 7, maybe 8. Difficult to tell through the smoke and the haze and his own blurred vision. They were reforming, gathering for a final coordinated strike, and he knew with absolute certainty that Laffey could not survive another concentrated attack. Too many guns were destroyed or out of ammunition. Too many men were wounded. The ship was on fire in 4 separate locations. The damage control parties were exhausted, beyond the point where courage matters, running on pure animal stubbornness. He considered ordering abandon ship. It would be the reasonable choice, the choice that saved lives. But something in him, perhaps pride, perhaps the knowledge that abandoning ship meant condemning the wounded who could not be moved, perhaps simple stubborn refusal, rejected the idea. They would fight until the ship sank beneath them or until the Japanese ran out of planes. Those were the only acceptable outcomes. The 7th Kamikaze dove at 08:37, and this time, fate, or mathematics, or the blind probability that governs combat, turned against the Japanese. The plane was a 0, and it came in at a perfect angle, avoiding most of the defensive fire, and it should have hit squarely amidships. But at 200 feet above the deck, a 5-inch shell, fired not at this plane but at another target, one of the thousands of shells Laffey had sent into the sky, intersected the Zero's flight path through a pure chance. The shell did not explode. It simply punched through the plane's fuselage like a fist through paper, and the Zero came apart, the structural integrity destroyed, pieces spinning in different directions, the bomb falling free and detonating in the water 50 yards away. On the bridge, Becton watched this impossible luck and laughed, a sound with no humor in it, just the recognition of how thin the line was between existence and oblivion. "Get me damage reports," he said to the radio man, "and get me a cigarette." The reports came in, and they were grim but not fatal. The ship was still making 22 knots despite the damaged steering. The forward magazines were secured, the fires contained if not extinguished. The casualty count was climbing. 32 dead confirmed, 71 wounded. But the wounded were being treated, morphine and sulfa drugs and battlefield surgery in compartments still thick with smoke. Pharmacist's mate second class. Robert Carr had set up a triage station in the crew's mess, separating the men who would live from the men who would die, and he worked with the cold efficiency that medicine demands, ignoring the screaming, ignoring the blood, just cutting and stitching and injecting, because anything else meant more men would die. One of the wounded, Seaman First Class Eugene McCarthy, had taken shrapnel across his back when the 4th Kamikaze hit. The metal fragments had shredded muscle and cracked ribs, and he should have been in shock, should have been unconscious. But he was passing ammunition to the nearest gun position, moving by instinct, and when Carr tried to pull him away for treatment, McCarthy snarled, actually snarled like an animal, and kept working. Later, when the battle was over and McCarthy finally allowed himself to be treated, he would remember none of this. His mind had shut down everything except the immediate task. Lift Carry, pass, repeat. The higher functions, pain, fear, self-preservation, came back only when the threat ended. The 8th Kamikaze attacked at 0841, and the 9th came 30 seconds later. A coordinated assault from 2 directions. Laffey's guns hammered at both targets, the crews operating in a fog of exhaustion and cordite smoke. But one of the Judy bombers got through. It struck the port side, aft of the bridge, and the bomb penetrated the deck before exploding in the crew berthing compartment. 12 men died there, most of them asleep in their bunks. They had been off watch, resting, and death came without warning in a blast of pressure and fire. The explosion buckled the deck plates, cracked a main steam line, and filled 2 compartments with scalding steam. In the forward engine room, Lieutenant Commander Mackey saw his pressure gauges drop and knew what had happened. A major steam leak meant reduced power, meant the ship would slow, meant they would become an easier target. He made a decision without consulting anyone because there was no time to consult. He ordered the crew to bypass the damaged line, rerouting steam through auxiliary systems never designed for full power loads. It was a jury rig, unstable, likely to fail catastrophically. But it kept the engines running at 18 knots. And 18 knots was enough to maneuver, enough to present the guns to targets, enough to live a few more minutes. Commander Shibata, circling above in his reconnaissance plane, transmitted his final report to the task force commanders on Kyushu. Target, heavily damaged, but still operational. Estimate 12 direct hits. Enemy refuses to sink. Request immediate reinforcements. He paused, then added something that would later be redacted from official records, but survived in his personal diary. American defensive capability exceeds all predictions. Kamikaze doctrine requires revision. This was heresy, military apostasy. The kamikaze tactic was not just a tactical innovation, but a spiritual weapon, a demonstration of Japanese moral superiority over the materialistic Americans. To suggest it was failing was to question the fundamental premises of Japan's war strategy. But Shibata was watching the failure unfold below him, watching his pilots die not in glorious sacrifice but in futile attempts to sink a single enemy ship, and intellectual honesty compelled him to report what he saw, even if it cost him his career or his life. At 08:53, 66 minutes into the attack, the 10th kamikaze struck. It was the last of the formation that had attacked with such confidence an hour earlier, and the pilot, we will never know his name, never know his thoughts in those final seconds, came in low and fast, evading the 5-inch guns threading through the 40mm fire, and crashed into the starboard side of the ship's aft deckhouse. The explosion destroyed the aft damage control station, killed 5 men, and started yet another fire, this one in the ammunition storage for the 20mm guns. Ensign John Michael, 23 years old, philosophy major from Princeton, who had enlisted the day after Pearl Harbor, saw the fire spreading toward the ammunition lockers and understood with perfect clarity that if those lockers exploded, the chain reaction would destroy everything aft of the bridge. He grabbed a fire extinguisher and ran toward the flames, followed by 2 other sailors who had made the same calculation, and together they created a fire break, spraying chemicals onto the deck, pushing the flames back, buying seconds. The heat was unbearable. Michel's uniform started to smoke, then char, but he held his position until the damage control party arrived with proper equipment. And only then did he allow himself to collapse, his hands a ruin of burned meat, his lungs seared from inhaling superheated air. Later, in the hospital ship, where Michel would spend 4 months recovering, he would tell an interviewer, "I wasn't brave, I was just doing the math. The ship had to survive." That was the only variable that mattered. My survival was irrelevant to the equation. This was the mentality that broke the kamikaze tactic. Not courage in the traditional sense, but a cold calculation that individual survival mattered less than collective purpose. Exactly the mentality, the the Japanese had believed was their unique cultural weapon. At 0902, 75 minutes after the first attack, the sky was empty of enemy aircraft. The last Kamikaze had crashed into the sea, 400 yards away, shot down by the combined fire of every gun that could still operate. Laffey steamed in a wide, uncontrolled circle, trailing smoke from 5 separate fires, her decks littered with wreckage and bodies, her white paint scorched black, her hull punctured in a dozen places. But she steamed. Her engines ran, her flag flew. Commander Becton, bleeding from half a dozen cuts, his uniform torn and burned, stood on the ruins of the bridge and felt nothing at all. Shock, probably. Blood loss. The emotional overload that comes from confronting death for an extended period. He would process it later, wake up screaming in the night for years afterward. But in this moment, he was simply a ship's captain, performing his duties. Casualty report, he said. The final count took hours to compile. 32 dead, 71 wounded. 6 kamikaze hits, plus 4 bombs dropped by planes that were shot down before crashing. 22 separate attacks over 80 minutes. And Laffey had survived, had shot down 9 aircraft, definitively, and damaged several more, had remained operational despite damage that should have sent her to the bottom. The rescue tugs found her 2 hours later, still making headway under her own power. The crews of the rescue ships stared in disbelief at the damage. One tug captain later wrote that he had expected to find a sinking wreck, not a functioning warship. And Laffey's crew stared back with hollow eyes, too exhausted to feel pride or relief or anything except the vast emptiness that follows sustained terror. The wounded were transferred first, lowered on stretchers to boats that ferried them to hospital ships. Seaman McCarthy, finally allowing himself to be treated, was carried off still clutching a shell casing, his fingers frozen around it. Ensign Michael went out unconscious, his burned hands wrapped in morphine-soaked bandages. Commander Carpenter, the executive officer, had to have his leg amputated aboard the hospital ship. The shrapnel wound had severed the femoral artery, and only a tourniquet applied by a radio man had kept him from bleeding out. Laffey herself was towed to Saipan, then to Seattle, a 6,000-mile journey at the end of a cable. In the shipyard, workers swarmed over her, cutting away damaged sections, welding new plates, replacing destroyed systems. The repairs took until August, and by the time they were complete, the war was over, ended not by invasion but by atomic fire that made the kamikaze tactic, made all conventional tactics, suddenly obsolete. But the ship's story lived on. In Japan, Laffey became a case study in the failure of spiritual weapons to overcome material superiority. Young naval officers, rebuilding their fleet in the post-war years, studied the battle as an example of what not to do, sending poorly trained pilots in obsolete aircraft against an enemy with radar, communications, and industrial reserves that could absorb losses that would cripple Japan. The kamikaze myth, that sacrifice alone could overcome technical inferiority, died slowly in Japanese military thinking, but Laffey was one of the blows that killed it. In America, the ship became a symbol of a different mythology. The idea that American technological prowess and democratic values created a kind of invincibility, that free men fought better than soldiers, indoctrinated with death cults. This was simplistic, ignored the role of fear and luck and the proximity fuses that British physicists had invented. But mythology is always simplistic. What mattered was that Laffey had faced the worst the Japanese could throw at a single target and survived, and in the zero-sum arithmetic of war, survival equals victory. The ship was decommissioned in 1947, then recommissioned for Korea, then decommissioned again in 1975. She was saved from the scrapyard by veterans who remembered, by historians who understood her significance, and today, she rests at Patriots Point in Charleston, South Carolina, a museum ship with her battle scars still visible in the steel. You can walk her decks, Touch the guns that fired more than 1,000 rounds that April morning. Stand where Commander Becton stood and try to imagine 80 minutes of sustained terror. But you cannot imagine it, not really. The human mind is not built to sustain that level of threat awareness, that certainty of imminent death for over an hour. The men of Laffey did not imagine it either. They experienced it, and it changed them in ways that no amount of peacetime training could replicate. Some broke under the strain, spent the rest of their lives jumping at loud noises, unable to sleep without medication. Some thrived, found that combat had revealed capacities they never knew they possessed, and spent decades seeking that intensity in civilian life, never quite finding it. Most simply endured, carried the memories quietly, and refused to discuss them with anyone who had not been there. Commander Becton retired as a rear admiral. He never commanded another ship in combat, which was probably a mercy. He wrote a memoir in 1986, clinical and factual, that hinted at the emotional cost, but never stated it explicitly. He died in 1995, age 94, and at his funeral, 17 survivors of Laffey's crew formed an honor guard. Old men who had been young together in the crucible of that April morning. The Japanese pilot who struck the bridge, whose bomb failed to detonate, was never identified. His body was not recovered. He exists in the historical record only as a statistic, one of roughly 4,000 kamikaze pilots who died in the Okinawa campaign, one of the 3,900 young men whose sacrifice bought Japan. Nothing but a few more months of war and a demonstration that courage without resources is just death. The paradox of Laffey's survival is that it demonstrated both the limits and the power of technology in war. The ship survived because of radar, proximity fuses, redundant systems, radio communications, and industrial capacity that could station a destroyer with more firepower than a 19th-century fleet in front of an enemy air assault. But it also survived because of men like Seaman Johnson, who kept firing when any rational calculus said he should flee, because of Ensign Michael, who ran toward fire when every instinct screamed to run away, because of Lieutenant Commander Mackey, who jury-rigged steam systems without reference to any technical manual, because of Commander Becton, who refused to quit when quitting was the reasonable choice. The Japanese generals who observed the battle from Kyushu understood the technical lesson, that kamikaze tactics could not overcome the American defensive envelope of radar and massed anti-aircraft fire. But they missed the deeper lesson, or perhaps could not accept it, that the Americans had their own form of dedication unto death, their own willingness to sacrifice, their own code that demanded fighting beyond the point of exhaustion. The difference was that the Americans built systems that amplified individual sacrifice rather than requiring it, that used technology to reduce casualties rather than maximize them, that treated their sailors as valuable assets to be protected rather than expendable munitions to be fired. This was the real shock that Laffey delivered to Japanese military thinking, though it would take decades to fully acknowledge the realization that the Americans' seemingly materialistic, individualistic culture could produce collective action and self-sacrifice equal to anything Bushido demanded, but could do so while also valuing individual human life. It was a paradox that Japanese commanders, trained in a system that equated individual survival with shame, could not easily process. In the end, Laffey survives not just as a museum ship, but as a refutation of the idea that technology dehumanizes warfare, or that industrial societies cannot produce heroes. The ship's 80 minutes under fire proved that heroism in modern combat is not less real for being mediated by radar and radio, that courage does not require accepting death, but rather accepting risk while fighting desperately to survive, that the highest form of sacrifice is not to die for one's country, but to be willing to die while doing everything possible to live and complete the mission. The battle was studied in military academies for decades, dissected in tactical journals, turned into training films. But all the analysis missed something essential, something that can only be understood by standing on Laffey's deck at Patriot's Point, running your hand along the scarred metal and trying to imagine what it felt like to be 19 years old, standing at a gun that fired 600 rounds per minute, watching planes dive at you out of the sun, knowing that each one carried a man who had already accepted death, and deciding that you had not accepted death, that you would fight, that your ship would not sink, that you would load and fire until either the Japanese ran out of planes or you ran out of heartbeats. That decision, multiplied by 336, made in 1,000 individual moments over 80 minutes, is why USS Laffey survived. The technology helped, radar and radios and proximity fuses and redundant systems. But machines do not decide to fight, men do, and the men of Laffey, despite their fear and their pain and their absolute certain knowledge that they were about to die, decided to fight, and that decision, more than any weapon or tactic or strategy, was what shocked the Japanese generals and kamikaze pilots into recognizing that the war was lost, that no amount of spiritual dedication could overcome an enemy who combined technical superiority with equal dedication, who built machines that protected human life while demanding human sacrifice, who refused to accept death as the price of honor. The ship that could not sink. The title was not hyperbole, but simple recognition of a truth proven in steel and blood, that when technology, training, and human will align, the result is a resilience that exceeds any calculation, that breaks the enemy's confidence more surely than any weapon, that transforms a single ship's survival into a symbol of why some nations win wars and others lose them.